If I told you there's a crop that contains all 9 essential amino acids, survives, brutal droughts restores depleted soil, grows where fertilizers fail, feeds entire communities and costs almost nothing to cultivate, you'd assume it's already at the center of global food policy. You'd expect it to be backed by development banks, pushed by climate agencies, and subsidized at scale. But it's not. And once you understand why, you'll never look at the global food system the same way again. I've spent years digging into so-called miracle crops. Most don't survive real-world testing. They look good on paper, collapse in the field, or only work under ideal conditions with heavy inputs. Bambara groundnut is different. This isn't hype. This is a crop that quietly does everything the system claims it wants, while being systematically ignored by the institutions with the most power to scale it. And no, this isn't an accident. Before we go any further, let me be clear about something. I'm not coming at this from a feel-good sustainability angle. I'm not here to sell you a miracle food or jump on the latest green trend. I care about what works when conditions are bad, when money is tight, water is scarce, and systems fail. I've watched entire agricultural solutions crumble the moment subsidies disappear. Bambara groundnut keeps producing anyway. That alone should make you curious. Bambara groundnut isn't new. It's been cultivated across Africa for centuries, mostly by smallholder farmers, especially women. It grows underground like peanuts, thrives in poor soil, and requires minimal water. But here's the part that should have triggered global investment decades ago. Nutritionally, it's a complete protein. That puts it in the same category as eggs, dairy, and meat without the infrastructure, feed inputs, or environmental damage. For anyone who understands nutrition at a functional level, that's massive. Most plant proteins are incomplete. You have to combine them: rice and beans, corn and legumes, soy with supplementation. Bambara groundnut stands alone. No pairing required. That matters when you're feeding populations under stress. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. If Bambara groundnut checks all the boxes: nutrition, climate resilience, affordability, local adaptability, why isn't it funded? Why isn't it scaled? Why isn't it front and center in World Bank food security portfolios? The official answer sounds reasonable. They'll tell you it lacks sufficient large-scale data. They'll say yields are inconsistent. They'll argue it doesn't fit existing supply chains. They'll point to market readiness and investment risk. Those explanations fall apart the moment you compare Bambara groundnut to the crops that do receive funding. Corn doesn't survive droughts without irrigation. Soy doesn't fix nitrogen without heavy management. Wheat collapses under heat stress. Rice demands massive water inputs. Yet all of them receive billions in subsidies, research grants, and infrastructure support. Not because they're superior, but because the system is already built around them. This is the first truth most people never hear. Global food policy doesn't prioritize resilience, it prioritizes compatibility with existing power structures. Bambara groundnut doesn't slot neatly into multinational seed patents. It doesn't require proprietary fertilizers. It doesn't lock farmers into yearly input purchases. It doesn't centralize control. It scales horizontally, not vertically, and that's a problem for institutions designed to manage top-down solutions. I've talked to agronomists who love this crop in private and want to touch it publicly. Why? Because there's no funding stream attached. No career incentive, no big ag partner waiting at the end. You don't build a legacy project around a crop that empowers local farmers without dependency. And that is the second truth. What gets funded isn't what feeds people best. It is what sustains economic leverage. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but maybe Bambara groundnut just isn't productive enough, let me stop you there. Yield comparisons are often intentionally misleading. They measure output per hectare under ideal monocrop conditions, not survivability across failed seasons. A crop that produces moderately every year beats a high-yield crop that fails once every 5 years, especially in fragile regions. Bambara groundnut doesn't just survive drought. It produces when other crops don't even germinate. That's not a bonus feature, that's food security. Here's something else rarely mentioned. Bambara groundnut improves soil health through nitrogen fixation. That means less fertilizer dependency over time. Less fertilizer means less money flowing into chemical input markets. Less money flowing upward. You're starting to see the pattern. This crop threatens 3 major pillars of the industrial food system at once: input dependency, centralized control, and nutritional scarcity narratives. When a solution solves too many problems too cheaply, it becomes inconvenient. And this isn't theoretical. There are documented cases where pilot projects involving Bambara groundnut showed strong community outcomes but failed to receive follow-up funding. Not because they didn't work, but because they didn't scale in ways investors could extract from. If this is already making you uncomfortable, good. It should. Let me ask you something, and answer honestly. Have you ever heard about Bambara groundnut in mainstream nutrition media, in climate summits, in global hunger campaigns? Or did you just hear about it now? That silence tells you everything. In the next part, I'm going to break down the nutrition science, not the buzzwords. We'll compare Bambara groundnut directly against soy, lentils, chickpeas, and animal protein, line by line. No cherry-pick data, just what actually holds up. And if you want sources, research papers, and field reports, I've linked everything I reference in the description so you can check it yourself. Because this isn't about belief. It's about what survives reality. One of the biggest myths ever sold to the public is that protein scarcity is a technological problem. It's not. It's a framing problem. We're told again and again that feeding the world requires more processing, more engineering, more labs, more capital. But when you strip away the marketing and look at biological reality, protein has never been the bottleneck. Control has. I've analyzed protein sources for years, not from charts made for investors, but from what actually keeps people nourished when systems break down. And the moment you do that, the obsession with a handful of approved protein crops starts to look less like science and more like habit. Soy, corn, wheat, peas, lentils, chickpeas, all useful, all incomplete, all requiring combinations, processing, or supplementation to meet full amino acid needs. That's where Bambara groundnut quietly breaks the rules. It contains all 9 essential amino acids in meaningful proportions. Not trace amounts. Not technically present but nutritionally irrelevant. Real, functional completeness. That alone should place it in a rare category shared by animal proteins and a tiny handful of plant exceptions. Yet you almost never see it discussed that way. Instead, it's labeled underutilized, orphaned, or minor. Those words aren't descriptive. They're political. Here's something most people don't realize. The concept of incomplete protein didn't become popular because it helped people eat better. It became popular because it allowed systems to justify dependence on combinations and processing. If a population needs rice and beans together, you can manage supply chains. If they need soy plus fortification, you can manage factories. If they need supplements, you can manage markets. A single crop that does the job on its own is harder to control. When I compare Bambara groundnut to soy, the difference isn't just nutritional, it's structural. Soy's dominance depends on scale, monocropping, chemical inputs, and global logistics. Bambara groundnut works at the village level. It doesn't demand transformation. It adapts. That's incredibly valuable for people and incredibly inconvenient for centralized systems. Now let's talk about digestibility, because this is where a lot of plant proteins quietly fail. Protein content on paper means nothing if the body can't use it efficiently. Bambara groundnut scores surprisingly well here, especially when traditionally prepared. Communities that have eaten it for generations figured out processing methods that reduce antinutrients long before nutrition science caught up. Soaking, fermenting, roasting, simple techniques, no industrial processing required. That's another red flag for large institutions. When knowledge is local and transferable without licensing, there's no leverage. Compare that to modern plant protein narratives. Pea protein isolates, soy concentrates, engineered blends marketed as complete. They all rely on extraction, fractionation, and branding. The product isn't the crop, it's the process. Bambara groundnut cuts the process out entirely. And that's why you'll often see it described as promising but challenging. Challenging for who? Not farmers. Not communities that already grow it. Not regions dealing with drought and poor soils. The challenge exists at the institutional level, where value is measured in scalability that benefits investors rather than eaters. I've sat through panels where experts praise biodiversity while quietly dismissing crops like this because they don't fit yield maximization models. Those models assume stability. They assume irrigation. They assume subsidies will always be there. Bambara groundnut assumes none of that, and that makes it dangerous to the narrative. Let me put this plainly. If protein completeness were the true priority, Bambara groundnut would already be mainstream. The fact that it isn't tells you protein was never the main concern. This is where I want to hear from you. Had you ever been told that a drought-proof, complete plant protein already exists and has for centuries? Or is this the first time you're hearing it explained without buzzwords? In the next part, we're going to move out of nutrition and into economics. Not theory, real incentives. I'll show you exactly why crops like Bambara groundnut don't attract World Bank funding, while far riskier, less resilient systems do, and why that's unlikely to change without pressure from the outside. If you want to dig into the research yourself, I've linked studies and field data in the description. Don't take my word for it, verify it. That's how you know you're dealing with something real. Because once you understand the protein lie, you start to see the food system for what it is, not broken but deliberately shaped. Once you stop asking what feeds people and start asking what gets funded, everything snaps into focus. Institutions like the World Bank don't operate on nutritional logic or ecological logic. They operate on financial logic. That doesn't make them evil, but it does make them predictable. And predictability is exactly why crops like Bambara groundnut stay on the margins. Development funding doesn't flow toward what works best under stress. It flows toward what can be measured, standardized, scaled, and governed from the top down. That immediately rules out any solution that's decentralized by nature. Bambara groundnut doesn't need patented seed systems. It doesn't require annual input contracts. It doesn't collapse without fertilizer imports. That independence is its greatest strength and its biggest liability in a system built on dependency. When the World Bank evaluates agricultural projects, they're not just asking whether a crop grows. They're asking who manages the value chain, who controls distribution, and who captures long-term returns. Large-scale monocrops answer those questions cleanly. There's a clear hierarchy, a clear investment narrative, a clear exit strategy. Bambara groundnut doesn't offer that clarity. It spreads power outward instead of upward. I've reviewed project frameworks where success is defined not by nutrition outcomes, but by how neatly the project integrates into global markets. Export potential, commodity pricing, trade alignment. Bambara groundnut is primarily a local food. It feeds people where it's grown. That makes it almost invisible to institutions obsessed with GDP metrics and cross-border trade. Here's the part no one says out loud. A food solution that reduces reliance on imports inputs. And aid is bad for organizations whose influence depends on managing those flows. If communities can feed themselves with locally adapted crops, they need fewer loans, fewer interventions, and fewer capacity-building programs. Independence doesn't look like success on a balance sheet. This is why funding language matters. You'll see phrases like market-ready, investor-friendly, and value chain integration. Those aren't neutral terms. They filter out crops that don't generate extractable value. Bambara groundnut fails those filters by design. It creates stability, not acceleration. Stability is hard to monetize. And then there's the research funding problem. Most agricultural research is tied to downstream commercialization. Grants favor crops with clear pathways to patents, hybrids, or proprietary systems. Bambara groundnut varieties are largely open-pollinated and regionally adapted. Improving them benefits farmers directly, not shareholders indirectly. That makes them a poor fit for modern research incentives. I've spoken to researchers who admit, off the record, that working on crops like this is career suicide. There's no big journal splash, no corporate partnership, no pipeline to policy influence. So the data gap everyone points to isn't accidental, it's manufactured through neglect. Meanwhile, billions continue flowing into systems that repeatedly fail under climate stress. Failed harvests are treated as anomalies instead of warnings. The response is always more technology, more inputs, more debt, never a shift in power. Bambara groundnut represents a shift in power, and that's the real risk. Let's be honest about something else. If the World Bank fully backed a crop like this, it would undermine decades of development narratives. It would prove that some of the most effective solutions were ignored, not unknown. That's an institutional embarrassment few organizations are eager to confront. So instead, Bambara groundnut stays labeled as promising, eternally one pilot project away from recognition. Always studied. Never scaled. Always discussed in conferences. Never funded at the level it deserves. If you've ever wondered why food insecurity persists, despite all the money spent to solve it, this is a big part of the answer. The system isn't designed to eliminate dependence. It's designed to manage it. I want to pause here and ask you something. Do you think global hunger would look the same if funding rewarded resilience instead of control? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and the best insights usually come from people who've seen this play out firsthand. There is a big difference between a crop that looks good in reports and one that keeps producing when everything goes wrong. I care about the second category. Paper success doesn't feed anyone. Bambara groundnut has earned its reputation the hard way through failure conditions, not ideal ones. When rainfall becomes unpredictable, most crops don't just underperform, they collapse. Seeds fail to germinate. Plants bolt too early. Yields disappear overnight. Bambara groundnut responds differently. It slows down. It adapts. It finishes its cycle underground, protected from heat and moisture swings. That alone makes it fundamentally more resilient than surface-level legumes. I've seen data from regions where maize yields dropped to near zero during drought years while Bambara groundnut still produced something. Not abundance, not record harvests, but food. And when survival is the metric, something matters more than maximum. Another overlooked reality is labor. Bambara groundnut fits into existing farming routines without demanding new equipment or specialized inputs. That's critical for smallholder farmers, especially women who already shoulder most of the food production burden. When a crop integrates instead of disrupting, adoption happens naturally. No training seminars, no consultants, just continuity. There's also a misconception that resilient crops must taste bad or require cultural sacrifice. That's false. Bambara groundnut is already embedded in traditional cuisines across multiple regions. It's boiled, roasted, ground into flour, fermented, and combined into stews. It's food, not a supplement. That cultural compatibility is something development programs constantly underestimate and pay for later. What really stands out, though, is how this crop performs without safety nets. No fertilizer shipments, no irrigation infrastructure, no crop insurance. When other systems break because inputs stop arriving, Bambara groundnut doesn't notice. It was never dependent to begin with. This is why you don't hear dramatic failure stories about it. There's nothing to bail out. It doesn't spike and crash. It just continues quietly doing its job. In a world obsessed with growth curves, that kind of consistency gets mistaken for insignificance. I want to be clear here. Bambara groundnut isn't a silver bullet. No crop is, but it's a stabilizer. And stabilizers don't generate headlines. They generate food. There are field projects that show this clearly. In areas where farmers were given a choice, not a mandate, Bambara groundnut adoption often increased after drought years. Not because of persuasion, but because experience teaches faster than policy. People remember what kept them fed when everything else failed. This is where top-down development often misfires. It assumes farmers need convincing. Most don't. They need options that respect reality. Bambara groundnut does that without asking permission. Let me ask you something. If you were farming without guaranteed water, fertilizer, or credit, would you prioritize maximum yield or reliability? Think about that before dismissing crops that don't dominate export charts. If you want to explore some of the real-world case studies yourself, I've included links and sources in the description. They're not flashy, but they're honest. By now, the pattern should be clear. Bambara groundnut isn't ignored because it fails. It's ignored because it succeeds without permission. It doesn't ask for infrastructure before it produces. It doesn't collapse when subsidies disappear. It doesn't require rescue when the system stumbles. And in a world where control is often disguised as assistance, that independence is unsettling. The truth is, if institutions like the World Bank fully embrace crops like this, it would force a reckoning. It would expose how many unsolved problems were never unsolvable, just inconvenient. It would challenge the idea that food security must come with debt, dependency, and external oversight. That's not a conversation most large organizations are eager to start. I've seen how solutions get labeled radical simply because they don't reinforce existing structures. Bambara groundnut doesn't scale through boardrooms. It scales through fields. Farmer to farmer, season to season. That kind of growth is invisible to institutions trained to measure impact in funding cycles and press releases. What makes this crop powerful isn't just its nutrition, resilience, or affordability, it's what it represents. A reminder that effective solutions don't always arrive with branding, campaigns, or global endorsements. Sometimes they've been here the whole time, quietly outperforming the systems designed to replace them. This is why you'll continue to hear phrases like underutilized potential instead of missed opportunity. Language matters. It protects reputations. Admitting that a solution was ignored for decades is harder than promising it might be used someday. But here's the reality I've learned after years in this space. The future of food security won't be decided by conferences or funding announcements. It will be decided by what keeps people fed when plans fall apart. Crops like Bambara groundnut already passed that test. If there's a lesson here, it's not that we need new miracles. It's that we need the courage to stop dismissing old ones. Progress doesn't always mean inventing something new. Sometimes it means stepping aside and letting proven solutions do what they've always done. If this video made you rethink what innovation really looks like, let me know in the comments. I'm especially interested in hearing from people who've worked in agriculture, development, or food policy and have seen these dynamics up close. I've linked additional research and real-world case studies in the description for anyone who wants to go deeper. And if you want to keep exploring overlooked solutions like this, make sure you're subscribed. The next video picks up right where this one leaves off. Because the most powerful tools in the food system aren't the ones with the biggest budgets. They're the ones that still work when the budget disappears. And Bambara groundnut is living proof of that.